Welcome to Untold History, the channel where we explore the events that marked the destiny of humanity and whose repercussions still resonate in our society. Today, we will dive into one of the most shocking episodes of indigenous resistance against Spanish rule, the rebellion of Tupac Amaru II. This was one of the most dramatic episodes of resistance against Spanish colonialism in America. In 1780, Tupac Amaru II, an indigenous leader descended from the Incas, took up arms against the oppression of the Spanish Empire in the Andes. Through his leadership, he embodied the struggle for social justice and equality, seeking not only the liberation of his people, but also the abolition of the colonial abuses suffered by the indigenous people under Spanish rule. Despite the brutal repression that followed the rebellion, his name became a symbol of resistance and struggle for the rights of indigenous peoples in the Americas. His legacy is still remembered as a benchmark in the struggle against injustice and colonial oppression. What led Tupac Amaru II to lead a rebellion against the Spanish Empire? What were the repercussions of their struggle for future generations? To what extent did its uprising influence the independence of Latin America? Join us in this analysis of one of the most heroic and tragic chapters of our history. José Gabriel Condor Kanki Noguera, better known as Tupac Amaru II, was born in 1742 in the current territory of southern Peru. He came from a noble family of Inca descent and had access to a privileged education for the time. However, he witnessed the suffering of indigenous peoples, exploited by the Spanish colonial system through excessive taxes, forced labor in the mines, and a social structure that kept them marginalized. As tension between social classes increased in the Viceroyalty of Peru, Tupac Amaru became a defender of indigenous rights. In his first attempts at change, he presented petitions and claims to the Spanish authorities for the reduction of taxes and respect for the laws that protected the indigenous people. However, these requests were ignored and, in many cases, violently suppressed. The straw that broke the camel's back was the brutality of the corregidors, colonial officials in charge of the administration of the indigenous peoples. One of the most infamous was Antonio Arriaga, whose corruption and extreme abuse ignited the spark of the rebellion. In November 1780, Tupac Amaru II ordered the capture and execution of Arriaga in the town of Tungasuka, which marked the beginning of the revolt. What began as an act of justice soon turned into a mass uprising against Spanish rule. Thousands of disgruntled indigenous, mestizos, and even Creoles joined the cause. Tupac Amaru proclaimed the end of the Mita, the indigenous tribute, and slavery, which earned him enormous popular support. Rebel forces achieved important initial victories, defeating colonial troops in several battles. However, the lack of decisive support from the Creole elite and the harsh response of the Spanish crown weakened the rebellion. The colonial authorities deployed a fierce repression, sending a well-trained army that finally managed to capture Tupac Amaru and his family in 1781. The rebellion not only had an impact on the Viceroyalty of Peru, but also spread to regions such as Upper Peru, present-day Bolivia, and northern Argentina, where other leaders tried to follow suit. However, the lack of coordination and relentless repression led to the failure of these attempts. After his capture, Tupac Amaru was subjected to a summary trial in Cuzco and sentenced to a brutal execution. On May 18, 1781, he was forced to witness the torture and murder of his relatives before being publicly dismembered. His death, though violent and cruel, did not mean the end of his legacy. The rebellion continued with other leaders, albeit with less success, and their sacrifice inspired future struggles for independence in Latin America. In addition to Micaela Bastidas, another key figure in the rebellion was Tomasa Tito Condameda, an indigenous leader who organized hundreds of women in the resistance. Her role was key in logistics and combat, but her story has been less visible in the official narrative. The punishments imposed by the Spanish crown were not only physical, but also symbolic. The use of Quechua in official documents was prohibited and measures were intensified to eradicate any vestige of Inca culture. However, far from disappearing, the memory of Tupac Amaru II and his struggle endured in the indigenous communities. Despite extreme repression, the ideals of the rebellion were not in vain. Decades later, Independence movements throughout Latin America took up many of Tupac Amaru's demands, such as the elimination of the indigenous tribute and the abolition of forced labor. In fact, its uprising served as a direct precedent for the independence processes that were brewing in the region. Even today, in the 21st century, his figure continues to be vindicated by indigenous and social movements that seek justice and equity in Latin America. In Peru, his legacy is remembered in education, politics, and the struggles for the rights of indigenous peoples. His name is synonymous with resistance, dignity, and the struggle for a more just world. The rebellion of Tupac Amaru II was an act of courage and resistance that, although it failed in its immediate objective, left an indelible mark on the history of America. Their struggle not only made colonial exploitation visible, but also sowed the seed of future independence movements. Her name remains a symbol of social justice and the fight for equality. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you have been interested in this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like it, and leave us your comments. What do you think about the rebellion of Tupac Amaru II? Do you think that its uprising influenced the independence of Latin America? We'd love to read your thoughts. Until next time in Untold History.